Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DZT webinar this evening. My name is Jewel. I'm the Executive Director of the Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment. So what the endowment is in simple terms, is the fund that awards numerous scholarships that we have this year, allows for webinars like this to be put on, and encourages in-person events, online events for general mentoring and education and networking within the industry. So I've been proud to be the executive director of this organization since its inception in 2012, and really excited personally to be here in particular this evening because Alex Armstrong, our 2023 recipient, has been a longtime friend of the organization. And so when he received the award in 2023, it was really exciting. Because there's just been a lot of conversations with him over the years about so many brilliant ideas he's had. And so this is just very, very exciting for me to be able to host this evening. So some of you got a tasting kit, which is amazing. Thank you so much for ordering that. If you did not order the tasting kit, no need to stress. I'm going to turn it over to my lovely friend there, Alex.
My name is Alex. I'm a cheese professional and sensory evaluator, cheese specialist and cheesemonger. And during my travels, I was actually working as an affineur at Jasper Hill Farm and was doing their sensory evaluation program there. Where I'm at now is still pursuing the sort of endless journey of my sensory evaluation practices. And I'm really excited to share my journey through the DZT endowment, where I did get to learn a little bit more about sensory evaluation as a whole, some of the philosophies and the foundations. And this exploration was huge for my well-being and my knowledge of cheese. And what I learned the most was that I have a lot more to learn. And so this presentation, just to orient us a little bit on our journey, is really a foundation, a lot of the philosophy and aspects around sensory evaluation, how we might be able to think about it in a new light or in a different way and apply it to our everyday work. But I will also have, I think, I'm hoping, many more presentations that get into the nitty-gritty of each aspect of sensory evaluation as a whole. Without further ado, join me on a delightful journey. So what's the vision? So each project through the Daphne Zepos Teaching Award has a specific focus. And for me, I really wanted to focus on my main body of work that I've sort of grown into over the years, which is sensory evaluation. And so in particular, I really wanted to understand, what is it for? Why is it important? But also really understanding the different practices that are around it in terms of European methodologies, US, if there's specific countries that are doing anything in particular that are really nuanced or really indicative of that culture. And I really wanted to really try to understand how those processes come about. So do we need to have education about sensory practices, or is it just something we do sort of on the wayside? And really, what that meant is that I wanted to study from specific European producers. I couldn't catch them all. Apparently, there's a lot of them in Europe, but I was able to find a few that would let me tour around with them for a couple days and really get into the deep diving of all their cheeses. So that was really sort of the crux of what my vision sort of started as. And I really developed this thesis for myself to stay oriented as I'm really kind of going through the project. And it was really about um, really understanding that sensory evaluation and its tool set is really valuable to the cheese community as a whole. So what that means is that these sensory evaluation tools, specifically our senses, are going to be something that's invaluable as we get on into specialty cheese and cheese making as a whole. And really what I was hoping to find out is really the different ways in which we can communicate about cheese, through cheese, and with cheese, and how intrinsic that is to our community and into our industry. Let's get into the very basics of what sensory analysis is from a scientific standpoint. This is a definition you'd find if you just really Google sensory evaluation. And it really breaks it into four parts of really understanding how to prepare a sensory evaluation mode, which would be in evoking certain parameters. So you're setting your scene, then you're measuring the different characteristics that are coming about through your study in situ, and then you're analyzing the data and making conclusions through interpretation. And so when I was really looking at this definition and how I actually do sensory evaluation in my day-to-day, I really saw a unique analog with cognitive science. And so cognitive science is a multidisciplinary pursuit in science as well, where it's really trying to understand the different ways in which our senses make sense of the world. And that's the most basic way I can kind of put it. So really taking our subjective human experience and really building a picture of the objective realities of our world. And so what I really tried to do while I was learning and studying with these producers is understanding how I could apply this approach in order to really better conceptualize sensory evaluation, to kind of capture the work that we can do with it and the different ways that we can pursue education and different types of projects. And at the heart of that is the human body. So if we line up the two, cognitive science and sensory evaluation, you can actually see there's a pretty clear comparison here, where on the right with sensory evaluation, these are our sensory tools. These are all the things that we can use to evoke our sensibilities, or that use our senses to make sense of what the cheese is doing, what the creamery is doing, what the farms are doing. And on the left, you see already there's, if you want to really get into the abstract side of it, they're really the same tenets in cognitive science. And so for me, I tried to organize my thought process then in what I'm calling the sensory triad. Who knows, the name might change, but sensory language, which really encompasses the vocabulary and organoleptics. So the language of the senses and our actual language. Sensory memory, which is really about how the traditions of the past inform the practices of the future, and also who we are, really understanding like day after day what type of cheese producer we want to be. And then sensory praxis, which a lot of my friends were really pumped that I could get praxis in there on my project. Really, it's about the theory of doing. So really putting what you know into actual everydayness and seeing how it actually works for you. So let's get into the senses just to get really like on the baseline here. These are the organoleptics that we'll be talking about. And so sight, touch, smell, taste, and sound. So breaking it down just in terms of pretty quickly here in terms of cheese, sight is pretty obvious. Does the cheese look like the cheese you're trying to make? Does the cheese look like it has defects? Is there things that I'm seeing that are either triggering a response or all's normal? Taste, those are the receptors on your tongue. We're all pretty familiar with them. You have all five, the sweet, salty, sour, umami, and bitter. And those are going to be your baseline foundation for all of your tastes. Smell is actually, I think, one of the most important parts of our tasting abilities, where the olfactory sense is actually going to get you a lot more out of that tasting component than just your tongue alone. And that sort of olfactory relationship really brings a much bigger picture of flavors and really understanding of that cheese's profile. Touch can be considered really how a cheese feels between your fingers, if it's a greasy paste or a granular dry paste, but also mouthfeel, which we really don't conceptualize as really different from touch or texture. But mouthfeel and texture actually do have different components there. Sound is also a little difficult, but if you think of like a little cheese crystal crunching in between your teeth, or a squeakiness of a cheese curd, that does give you an indicator in some aspects there. So before we get too locked into our journey, our seatbelts buckled, helmets on, I'd like you to just briefly taste the cheeses that you have with you. I believe you have OG Crystal and Harangbach. And I really want this to be a waking up of the palate. And if you'd like, feel free to write notes about it while you're eating. We're going to get our flight going here. So the journey took me throughout Europe, visited a lot of places, not everywhere made it into the presentation, but just wanted to showcase how wide and the sort of breadth and depth of this whole journey took me. And the purpose of my project, or the organization of it as well, is really to try to bring you with me. It's really hard to, especially in the sense of a sensory evaluation, it's hard to communicate that true intrinsic value. So for me, I'm really hoping to build that journey for you and show you what I've learned. So today we're going to start with France. If you're familiar with Fromagère Mons, they're over in South Central France in a town called Rouen. And they're a 3-generation old Affineur. And right off the bat, what you really understand from this French cheese making community is that the really in-depth and intrinsic value of the traditions that they have been really trying to promote throughout their whole cheese making journey. So we all know the French standard, and for them, it is really truly a way of life, and how they really have a true reverence for these traditions. And that is really indicative in all the cheeses that they make. And so Fromage Mons is an affineur. They do not make any cheeses, but they do age many cheeses from France, and specifically work with producers very closely. And so as a representation of this third generation, Jules Mons, pictured here, standing in one of the most beautiful caves I've gotten to visit before, is actually now taking on more of a leadership role at the company, but also managing the selection process or grading process. For them, it's less about selections in this particular instance in where they're grading here, but really how understanding the trajectory and how these cheeses are aging. And so pictured here, you see some Beaufort, both young and old, from 2 different producers. And what I especially appreciate about this photo is that they are rugged, but that is exactly what they're supposed to be. And that's really part of their standard. So what we see here in this cave is something that I really that really tied together this traditional practice. Is what you see on the left is the technology for operating the cave. You have a hygrometer measuring the temperature and humidity. You have a lantern, which more for ornamentation, but that's kind of it. And so there is a little air exhaust in the back there. But this cave is an old train shaft that was in operation for maybe 30 years, early 1900s. And really what you see there, vaulted ceilings. So the natural convection, so that the heat from the fermenting cheese is actually being circulated and the air is staying cool. There's water runoff, as you can see in the bottom there. There's a little trough that's going to be running that water down. So there's passive humidification. And then the rest is the know-how and the feeling and the understanding of that cave and the cheeses with the Affineur. And there's only 2 gentlemen that are really in there day in, day out, taking care of those cheeses by hand. Like, what does that look like, taking care of the cheese and grading and assessing it? This is one of their grading forms for what they'll do is they'll taste through pretty much every sort of batch that they have in there, usually ranging from different producers and different ages. And they're going to assign to them a score in terms of the appearance, texture, and the flavor. Those tend to be those 3 core tenets that you're really going to evaluate with. And then they're going to give notes as well. Specifically, I wanted to point out down in the middle there, super genial, top, top, top. That's the best. That's a really good cheese. And if we look over on the side here, 20.7 out of 25. It's a good score. That's pretty good. None of these are even above that, to be honest. So that's a good cheese, and they're actually indicating that here, not in just their commentary, but these texture and appearance scores and taste scores. Right below it, both. Not so good. And for them right there, they're already making decisions about where to sell it, how to sell it, and making sure that they're going to recheck that cheese to make sure, what are we going to do with it? Because at the end of the day, you got to sell that cheese. In order to make sure that you keep selling that cheese, you have to be specific. And so on the right there is a cheese that did not pass the test. They're not going to just sell it saying the world will get it. It's cheese. We're French. It's going to be delicious. But what they're doing is they're actually taking that process to the end line and saying, we only want the best of the best out in the world, because at the end of the day, that's going to also support their producers. So it's really important for them to actually have that process in place so that they're actually managing the quality of that cheese and also protecting and honoring those traditions of all the people before. And so part of their whole overall ethos for Fromagerie Mons is a commitment to education. And so they do have an educational organization, the Formation Mons, and what they do is actually have a core curriculum that is available in many languages across the world. And they're teaching other cheese professionals, not just to be French affineurs, but how to be affineurs in their country. And that's a really important aspect of spreading that education, that knowledge, that long-standing tradition. And what I really wanted to highlight with this photo here is this, to me, seems like a perfect analog or personification of communicating through senses. I don't speak the best French. I don't read the best French, but this little diagram here shows me pretty much how to make butter. Will I be able to make butter right away? No, but this really kind of gets at this type of communication that maybe is with words, maybe is with pictures, maybe is with colors, but at the end of the day is going to actually communicate something worthwhile in a message. And so I found this to be particularly interesting. And what does it look like if you're actually educating the world? That education actually makes it all the way to the counter. And in France, there's one of the highest accolades that you can get in the agricultural or culinary scene, Meilleur Ouvrier de France. And Fabien Degoulay, who is pictured here at his shop in Le Mans, Fromage et Ses Amis, is one of, to me, one of the most outstanding cheese professionals in the world. He has a lot of knowledge about cheese in general. He brings his expertise from his food journeys, which actually involve spending a lot of time in Japan. And he owns now a shop that has both his cheeses that he's been selecting and further aging in his caves. Again, trying to really continue on this journey that the cheese is doing, but also using these techniques, methods, and knowledge that is passed on through the chain. It's not just stuck at the affineur, it goes all the way on to the cheese professional. But he's also making his own affinage in-house of specific cheeses. So if you look closely on the left, you can see Rangbach, which you have on your plate there from Sweden. You can see in the middle shelf is actually Whitney and Alpha Tolman from Jasper Hill Farm. First American cheese in the case, pretty big deal. And what he's doing is actually aging that cheese to be a profile that French people like. So when he was first getting the cheese in, it wasn't selling very well. And it wasn't because the cheese wasn't delicious. It was not what they were used to. And so his way of bridging the gap is actually continuing that affinage, which is something that you don't really see in the US very successfully all the time. And at the end result, all of this knowledge, all of this work, all of this compassion towards cheese ends in a delicious table of delicious cheese with your friends. And that's exactly what Fabien is really trying to cultivate there. But to me, this picture is quintessentially a French cheese board. It is just absolutely decadent and absolutely delicious, but still you can see some wildness all over there on the board. So what did we learn from our French journey here? Trying to tie together here some of these concepts, which you'll see kind of some of the similarities between these cheese producers as we go along. But to me, really, the generational knowledge and practices is really, really part of the French cheese community. They are almost it's almost type of folklore as in terms of their types of traditions and their practices, and that they really are truly invested in making French cheese. And sometimes to a fault, but that's not for me to judge. But really, they are truly trying to continue on this work that's been around in their communities for hundreds of years. And so far, I think French cheese is doing quite okay. The commitment to education, I think, is very key. Sensory practices or even just learning about cheese kept in a vacuum really does not help anybody in the industry. And being able to sort of share this knowledge and bring people to the table actually helps communicate also the importance of the work that you're doing. If you're doing all of this high quality work and it's lost on everybody, it's almost as if you're walking through an art museum and have never looked at a picture before. You're going to walk through there thinking, I'm not experiencing anything. And so for them, it's really trying to bring all this together in a new light. And lastly, what I really think is going to be the hallmark throughout this project and really our exploration of what terroir means. Cheese is people. The people who make the cheese are inseparable from the terroir that is of the place. So we talk a lot about the animals, the farms, as being sort of that taste of place, the region. Can't forget those people who are actually making that happen and who are really bringing that to alive. And so for me, the French experience was really articulating that particular terroir. One of my favorite affineurs in the world, Frederick von Tricht. Him and his father have one of, I would say, the most modernized facilities in Belgium, in Antwerp, and where they actually age and sell many cheeses across many different categories. But most specifically, they have focused on highlighting and bring about awareness of all of the Belgian cheeses that are sort of still in the specialty scene. So we're going to back up about 519 years and look at a delightful painting that was at the Museum of Art down in downtown Antwerp. And I got struck immediately by this photo or this painting because you see right there almost front and center, we'll go to the right a little bit, is two wheels of cheese. One with a pretty dark paste. I'm not really sure what cheese is going on there. And then one below that looks pretty familiar in terms of like a Gouda style or some sort of tome. And even depicted in this painting, you can see little intrusions of mold, some little pockets, or even just open texture, and even the knife cuts. And so you can still see that Belgian cheese still has this heart back 500 years. This painting was titled "The Dutch Breakfast," so it's part of their everyday life. But cheeses from Belgium have evolved, just like Europe has become closer together and commingling with a lot of different culinary aspects. So this is a cheese board that Frederick prepared for me that actually showcases most of the styles from Belgium that he ages and sells and works directly with those producers. And what you see here is actually cheeses that are pretty similar in terms of like a French style. You see some lactic set goat cheeses there that are some with ash. You see the Belgian Abbey style cheeses. You see following that are two types of aged Gouda style, so OG Crystal and the OG Ghost. And then you have a wash drying that was far too pungent in the best way, but it was very bold, and a blue cheese that has natural veining. So there's no piercing of the cheese. It's actually the curds being light, almost not pressed at all to give a little bit of this light oxygen flow. And the result, the texture was extremely fudgy and smooth, but it was wild and robust. But it was quite an experience to sort of see this whole repertoire of Belgian cheeses that before I'd even visited seemed I had only known of the sort of Trappist monk styles that really were kind of like written about in the history lore there. For Frederick, he's actually aging in 7 different rooms, different styles that go with like kinds. You want these molds to commingle, but you also want the right environments for each one. And what I thought was really fascinating is all of these cheeses have what we would call blemishes or mold intrusion, dapplings, and these would be very difficult to sell in the U.S. I would be hard pressed to see a lot of cheese shops in the United States, a lot of even just larger counters trying to manage with their customers that the blueness on those peaks is totally cool. It's a tough sell. And for him, he was like, I'm going to get a new batch next week. These will be gone. So what's really important there is that there is this whole understanding. It's both cultural, but also the way that they are able to speak about cheese and really tell the bigger story and communicate that value, that they're able to make this as part of the nomenclature. It is a normalcy to have a cheese that is wild, rugged, and delicious. For me, that what I really came to value with my time with Frederick was the actual affinage process. So he's taking cheeses from Belgium, but he's also taking cheeses from around the world and working with them together to highlight both the Belgian cheeses. He's really trying to show the world that they're here to stay and they're much more robust and wild than we come to know. But also he's putting his seat at the table with the rest of the cheese in the world. And so he's adding value to those Belgian cheeses by showing them on the same plane. So showing them alongside all of these other styles. And so a lot of his work, what he does is really trying to really involve the intrinsic value of cheese. What makes cheese so good? And it's not just that it tastes good, it's everything behind it. And if you're able to communicate that value, you're really doing the work to protect and preserve those different types of communities. So he really focuses a lot on these flavors and these aromas and these types of characteristics in order to really sell to his customers and understand that sort of relationship there. And what I really wanted to highlight here with Frederick is that his terroir really represents a living terroir. Terroir is not something that you have a stamp, it's on there, and it's going to stay the same forever. There's really no resilience in that process there. So terroir is actually a living concept. It's always in a state of becoming. And what you're going to see there is that terroir can change. And it's up to us to really be participating in that process or in terroir as a whole, so that you're really highlighting or communicating the values of these cheeses, which is really important. And something that I think really showcases this type of terroir as a way of life is none other than the wonderful Switzerland. As we step into the Alps, you can see classic mountainous range, little chalet on the hill. If you look extremely closely, you can see the cow paths up the mountains there. If you look even closer, you can see my mustache is looking particularly good in the middle photo. But I digress. So we are here in first to look at fromage Gruyere. Greg Egger, who is pictured here waiting anxiously for the morning milk at Fromagerie Grangette. He is the export manager for Fromage Gruyere SA, a cheese affineur, specifically Gruyere. And what we are doing is really the start of the day. And what's no more important in the cheese production of Gruyere is the milk. These producers, especially that are, I would say, they are now considered more specialty producers based on the volume that they're making. They are reliant on small dairies of maybe 20, 30 cows maximum, of a couple different farms to deliver the milk in the morning and in the evening, and they'll make cheese the following day. And so what's really important is this kind of highlights this part of the process where each aspect under the AOP, under these different foundations, each aspect of the cheesemaking process is focused on the quality of their product. So the farmers are producing milk. That's their job. They're not going to talk to Christophe Lopin about how he's going to set his vat. It would be just two ships in the night. So what they're doing here, what's really important here is small farms, consistent milk from regional dairies. So all surrounding the area. And what you can see then is that delicious, delicious milk going into a copper vat. Copper vats seemingly just look nice, but actually have a ionic charge that actually alter the milk ever so slightly. And so that is a really huge hallmark to the copper vats that are part of the AOP for making Gruyere. And what I thought was really interesting about this photo here, or these sets of photos, is the juxtaposition of high-tech, high-quality vat, really, really nice, and the most old-school technique. If you've seen Trevor Warmdahl's rennet presentation as well, that is the abomasum, the fourth stomach, dried and cut into strips. And something that's very important to me in this process here is Christophe is actually taking different vels, that's what the stomach is called, when they're dried, and he's cutting them in strips on widths based on the effectiveness of the actual rennet in those stomachs. So he'll get different lots, different batches of those stomachs, and they're not all the same. Not all cow stomachs are the same. And so what he's doing is trying to balance those different abomasums to really get the same result every time. And not a lot of cheesemakers are doing this because there is a variability there. But to me, having tasted his Gruyere alongside other ones, there's a different sort of DNA to his cheese. There is a noticeable difference. And to me, the flavors are stronger, louder, not necessarily as or more complex, but just as complex as the others. And so what you can actually see here is the traditional process. On the left, he's actually adding those stomachs to incubated whey. And so those are going to rehydrate, and he's going to add that back to the vat once he's ready to coagulate the milk. And you see this beautiful technology here. So those hoops there are going to be where all the curds are going to be sucked down through the bottom of the vat and then deposited right into each of those molds. And you can kind of see the grains are really tiny, and that's on purpose. He goes through a cooked pressed curd sort of structure there. So that's totally indicative of a Gruyere or a washed hard cheese. And what you see is those little granules are on purpose. A lot of times we think about curds as going to be like big, squeaky chonkers that you really want to eat with some sort of fried element. But what he's doing here is he's really pressing out a lot of that moisture, and getting a lot of the fats together. Once you press, is going to have a really exceptionally smooth texture, and really closed texture as well. And we actually got to put our hands in the vat, to really sense when those curds were ready to be sent over to the hoop. It's not just by timing. There's no machinery or sort of a digital readout that's going to say, your cheese is ready to go, dump it. It's him putting his hand in the vat and saying, do you feel that tock, 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 tock? That's ready. Do you feel this tock, tock, tock? It's not ready. And that was it. And that to me was a kind of something that really like blew my mind, but it was, of course, you got to feel when the cheese is ready. So what happens to that cheese after it gets pressed and chilling? After about 3 months, Greg here is being my lovely model of an AOP taxation representative. So taxation is another terminology in this specific context, to really grade and assess the cheeses on the AOP standards. So these graders and selectors are certified. They understand what profiles make Gruyere an exceptional Gruyere versus a B quality Gruyere. And so at 3 months, all Gruyères will be tasted and given a score. That's usually out of 20. And that will determine whether or not it gets the AOP stamp, if it can be sold as Le Gruyere AOP, and also if it will be going into a secondary market. Still good cheese, but it's not the standard. It's not what they're trying to really keep as Gruyere. And so part of Greg's job, along with his team, is to actually select for cheeses that they want as a profile. And they usually select only within this like 19 to 20 score. And the cheesemakers are extremely serious about that score. It's not just this point of pride. It's also, you get paid more. It's an incentivized system that if your quality is high, you get paid more. And it sucks to kind of sometimes put in those terms, but at the end of the day, it's an easy way to really guarantee that that quality is being sought after and not just left to the wayside and commodified. And so what Greg here does is actually selects 4 specific profiles and batches. And then what he's going to do is then bring those cheeses to Boule, which is the town near Gruyere, and age them in his facility. And so on the right here is one hallway of 20 hallways on 3 different floors of Gruyere. And I was already astounded at how much cheese was in there. I thought I was losing my mind. It's just like he keeps going and going and going. And every cheese we tasted had a different unique characteristic based on the farm it was from or the producer that was managing some of the affinage. And that amount of cheese only represents 15% of total Gruyere production in Switzerland. So they're relatively small as an organization compared to some of the bigger companies, but that's also what makes them extremely unique. They're really trying to select for this particular type of profile. And so at the end of the day, you can tell, or at least being with him, you can really tell this is 1655 Gruyere. This is not any other Gruyere. This is 1655 Gruyere. So for me, the regional focus and regional traditions are really part of Gruyere. Like you really can't separate Gruyere from Switzerland. You can maybe take it out, but it's never going to be not Swiss. They really follow this cooperative model, which I think is really huge. It's something that we don't really actually have very well set up in the US across cheesemakers. There are some instances and some examples, but this cooperative model allows for specificity at each of those junctures and allows you to have more control over the process at the end of the line, which is really interesting. And the AOP standards are not necessarily there to shackle those people to doing cheese making in one particular way. They're actually there to protect certain standards and give support for these cheesemakers. And then there's still room for this individual identity through people like Fromage Gruyere who are selecting batches, selecting cheeses. So Gruyere, when you're making Gruyere in Switzerland, it's really a way of life. It's part of their culture. You'll even find the most high quality Gruyere at a gas station for sale, and that was amazing to me. So we're gonna go to the other side of the country to visit another one of the king of cheeses. Many kings. Europe had many kings. Let's just be clear. No one's better than anyone. And what we have here is Gormino. So Gormino is another selector, affineur, but more on the German side of Switzerland. So you can immediately tell the difference just by being there, the architecture, the accents, and really just this overall feel of this side of Switzerland. And so I wanted to really understand what really made Emmentaler so special, mostly because to me, Emmentaler is a challenging cheese. It really is a difficult profile. Mostly it's a lower salt profile. The propionics, which is the bacterium that gives the cheese eyes, can sometimes have this like bitter, peppery, sour note to it. And I truthfully did not have very many Emmentaler representations. So I was really excited to see really what's happening here. And so I visited both a creamery in the morning and then also came to the Gormino Caves to actually see where it all kind of it becomes matured. And first, visually, you can see on the left side something pretty stark, which is really a great indication of age, but also how the cheeses are aging. Cheese on the left is obviously super young, pale, and the cheese on the right has seen some time, seen some wear, got some washes here and there to scrub away some mold. And then when you see on the right, the two different cheeses cut, they're a little inverted here on the photo, but the cheese on the left is actually much older. You can see the color is a little more pale. Those beta carotenes have broken down a little bit. The eyes are weirdly almost exactly the same as the other cheese, which is a pretty hard thing to do if you're trying to make a cheese based on a bacterial's preference to produce gas, which is amazing. Rind's much thicker, darker, and the cheese on the right, it still has the grassy sort of undertones. The texture looks a little bit more rubbery or pliable and relatively young. And when you taste those two cheeses together, the cheese on the right is something I'm sort of familiar with. We all know Baby Swiss here in the US. Not going to knock Baby Swiss, but it is much softer expression than the cheese on the right, which has a lot more robust character, a little bit more of the sweet and peppery and brothy side that I was not expecting, but was still Emmentaler. Like I could tell that there was still something tying it all together. They are really checking those cheeses in terms of their taxation based on the eyes. And what we're trying to do here is tap to get no more than 2 eyes, but no eyes is great because we're going to be bending that cheese and texturally, understanding it texturally.
Straight down.
Yep. So let's see how this strapping young lad did.
360 at least. Perfect. Nice. You know how it works.
No eyes.
No eyes.
Blind.
Blind, exactly. Perfect.
So the cheese on the left there is a little more friable. There's actually some breakage happening there. Cheese on the right is extremely elastic and bendy. And that bendiness is an indicator that there's going to be a lot longer aging capacity for that cheese. There's more time for the flavors to develop. Cheese on the left, as the minerals start to break down, the enzymes start to do their work, and the cheese loses some moisture, is going to get even more friable. And those flavors tend to be a lot shorter. And so what we found here is that the cheese on the right is actually going to be making it onto the table. It's going to be a delicious, delicious cheese. And the cheese on the left is something that what you would see as a defective cheese that they have removed from that whole process, removed from the overall sales channel. And they're really trying to make sure that the only profile that's going to be out there is something exceptional. And so the cheese on the left, you can really visually see they look rather bloated, and that is the propionics have become a little too advantageous and really blown up that cheese. So there's going to be a lot of eyes, And unfortunately, when you sell cheese by the pound and there's a lot of air in there, it's not the best cheese to put out there in the world. So what we're really seeing here with the core concepts with the Emmentaler and Gormino is their identity is really revolving around this selection. They're selecting specific cheeses, but they're also selecting the mountain dairies that they work with. They don't work with a ton of different producers, but they really work with a specified few. And all of their work is really there to their main ethos is to preserve and really promote both Emmentaler and the Swiss cheeses of their region. So they also age some Gruyères and also some Sprints, which is one of my favorite Alpine cheeses as well. And so really they're selecting for a particular type of terroir that is indicative of the mountain dairies, and also select through that selecting process is really promoting those producers and those styles out into the marketplace. And so not all of the Swiss producers are actually following all of these AOP standards or really like underneath the AOP umbrella. And two of them that I found to be particularly highlighting this was Yumi Cheese over in Bull, and then Käserei Turfisville, which is known for Hallerhocker, and that is Walter Ross there. And he is a generational cheesemaker as well. And he actually used to make Appenzeller for an AOP consortium, and decided to make the tough decision to leave that consortium, which is really a hard thing to do in Switzerland. He was seen as being quite insane for leaving and trying to make his own cheese. And I am so glad he did, because the world is now blessed with Hallerhocker and his other cheese, Turfisweiler. And what he does is still utilizes some of that same technology. His vat is absolutely pristine, but the scale is much different than what you'd see with Gruyere. Smaller, more wheels, but much more manageable, especially if you have yourself and maybe one other person to help. But he's really trying to build this cheese as a foundation for future cheeses for his community, but also for his family. His nephew just passed the cheesemaking exam. He's I think 18 years old, and he's going to be taking over cheesemaking through about 5 years. That's how long Walter wants to teach him before he trusts him with the gem that he has created there. And so Walter on the left there is actually working still under a sort of like a cooperative model, where he actually offloads his affinage to Gutensberger, which is just a 10-minute drive from his creamery. And there he can utilize some of the robot technology, the washing, but will still go down there to taste and select his cheeses and make sure that they're still on the right track. And so we actually went down there and tasted through a couple different batches. But on the right, what you see is a continuation of this divesting from a very specific standardization. And this is the cave for one of the caves for Yumi. And Yumi has two different aging facilities, one a little more traditional, but this is one is a true, I'd say, like homage to the old world, because it is actually an old farmhouse basement that the only technology besides those lights that you see there is a horse-haired brush and a pair of gloves. And I'm not even sure if those gloves were used for very much. And these cheeses are all aging by themselves, really ebbs and flows with the different environments underground. It changes a bit during the summer and the winter. He says it's a little bit more pungent in the summer. And but what they're trying to do is really highlight the like working with nature and really returning to nature and this natural process of cheese, and then finding a way to communicate that kind of value through their work. And so one cheese that really stood out to me as being the one really amazing example is the two cheeses here are actually the same cheese. It's called Blue Brain. It's a soft ripened lactic cow's milk cheese that is allowed to grow some rogue blue mold on the outside. That's got actually a really nice, even mold formation there. Little white spots there, pretty normal. And the cheese and that cheese is about 3 weeks old. The cheese on the right is 3 years old. And if you look closely, those are actual crystals forming and growing off of that cheese. And I tasted a piece the size of a grain of rice, and it was strong enough to totally overwhelm my palate, but it was still kind of delicious. It tasted really like eating a bouillon cube whole, and I only had the tiniest of morsels. So, and that's a cheese that they would actually they sell a 1 year aged version of it, and people buy them. And it's really trying to really like showcase and have a true expression of this like what seemingly is a fresh cheese. Can it be actually something else? Can it really be taken on a whole new level? And so really like these two producers for me really showcased the freedom from the AOP standards, and what that allows them to do is create these types of cheeses that maybe have some reminiscent parts of tradition, but also are working to sort of fight these industrial standards, and really letting this sort of natural cheese making process still be part of their everyday work. And so there is a particular freedom within terroir, where you get to be that player, that agent within that terroir system, and create a type of cheese that is really indicative of the place you live. We have made it to the second tasting. We're going to taste only just one cheese together. We're going to utilize our tasting diagrams and our sensory lexicons there. This spider graph here is something that definitely was championed by Jasper Hill Farm, and through my work there, I've worked to really adapt a more universal model that can be definitely edited. It's meant to be really flexible. I've added things here that are going to be a way that you can use to taste any cheese, but these are not by any means the only ways you can evaluate a cheese, just a nice archetype or foundation. And so I'm going to do mine together with you while tasting my piece of Rangbak. It's getting a little sweaty, so it's telling me it's definitely ready to be tasted. And the goal here, just before we get started, is we're going to do one of these together. And then if you have another type of pen or some sort of indicator to know which graph is which, do the second one over top. And what you're going to actually see then visually is the actual difference in profile. Standalone, it doesn't really tell a huge picture of what's happening. But once it's put up against another cheese's profile, you readily can see the difference in the two profiles, how they're tasting different. Maybe this cheese has more brothiness, and it's a way that you can easily learn to communicate the difference between cheeses, but then also see how those profiles, even within the same type of cheese, are changing, and from who those are being produced, what different methods have brought those differences about. And so we're going to go down to the bottom first. I like to do my little note taking. And what I do for appearance is I like to see the appearance of the paste, and as well as the rind. So if you do have some rind there, definitely take a look at that. And so what I would say is like a bronze rind. We have light dappling and mold. And then we're going to go, I'd say this is a pretty golden yellow hue. And light or slight open texture. We've got a couple of mechanical openings there. Texture, this is where you start to get into the actual cheese part. So I'm going to take a piece here. I do a little light pressing just to see how easily it comes away, and pressing a little in between my fingers too to see if just really that like softness, or if it stays together, if it's actually like crumbling off and becoming sandy. And so for me, I would write before I start tasting it, I'm going to write fudgy and smooth and elastic. So it does have some good bend and flavor. So this is where I think like it's really easy to get kind of stuck in trying to really describe 100% that flavor you're tasting, that one flavor, as if the cheese is just like one thing. What I'd like you to do is really use that flavor wheel to pinpoint the inner circle first, and then move yourself out as you're tasting to really see if there's any specific characteristics you're tasting. And for some cheeses, like butter is totally acceptable. That's a flavor. But you could also qualify it as cultured butter or sweet cream butter. or like salted butter. And so really I like to get those flavors as basic first before I start getting into the really nitty-gritty details of the different flavors. So tasting Rangback, this is a 18-month-old raw cow's milk cheese from Sweden. We're going to see where it's made and aged a little bit later on. For me, the first thing I'm getting is a lot of brothy. So I'm going to write that first as my that's already out of the way. And that really melts and ends or melds together. So I'm getting a little bit more of this almost mushroom and starchy. So I'm going to put potato, but gnocchi would be acceptable, something like that. All right. Potato. And I'm getting a pretty interesting mineral note. It's not necessarily like metallic or chalky like we see up there, but it's a little stony or an earthy aspect. So I'm going to go earthy. And I think that's going to do it for me for describing this particular batch. Because for me, those are the loudest notes and kind of capture the sweet, salty, savory aspects of it. Some of these batches are going to taste a little bit more floral or grassy, which is definitely kind of there, but it's not as prominent as I would have seen it in the past. So this tool here, I'm hoping to adapt into a much easier format or program that's not just using Excel, but the Excel is pretty accessible. And so I'm going to enter in scores that are based on 1 through 7. We use the scores 1 through 7 mostly because 4 is your good median, which gives you equal parts on the other sides of that scale, and gets you your outliers that are very clear. And we're only using whole numbers. So try not to use any halves or quarters or anything. You're just lengthening your data set, and you're really not getting a clear, stark difference between different characteristics. So walking through it, texture for this particular style of cheese, a 1 would be very sandy, granular, dry, breaking apart. And a 7 would be extremely pliable, almost like a string cheese. And so for me, I got a pretty smooth. It's elastic, but it does end up breaking, but not like crumbling into pieces. So I'm gonna go a 5 here. Lactic, so I'm getting more of that like butter, like really like fermented butter, and a lot of that cream forward. So I'm gonna probably put a 6 here to really, that's like a lot of the flavor that's going on right away. Sweet, it's really dominated by a salt profile. I'm not getting a ton of sweetness. I do think that lactic side of it does add to some of that sweetness. So I'm gonna go 2. Umami, this is extreme. For me, it's like really brothy. That was the first thing I wrote down there. So I'm going to put a 6, where I think if it was overly salty, which again, that's the next one, I'm going to put a 5, where it's a little higher than just balanced salt. I think that is on the higher side. That kind of adds to that sort of umami play. Salt is very important. The best way to really evaluate salt is 4 being perfect, 5 being high, 3 being low, and so on. If you're not thinking about salt, then it's perfect. If you want to add more salt, then it's not salty enough. If it's too salty, you already know. And it can be very difficult. Some cheeses and some profiles and also some cultures really like saltier cheeses, or some not so salty as well. Mineral, we did mention a little bit of that like stony, earthy vibe, which I did get, but I don't think it's overly pronounced. I'm going to put a 3. Acidity, could this be a little bit cheddary in some aspects? I think so. It's salt and acid really are hard to pin down sometimes, especially if they're both elevated. Acidity is going to touch the sides of your mouth and cause a little bit more dryness. Salt's going to really be front middle of your palate and add some more like salivating aspects. So I'm getting some acidity, but not more than the salt. So I'm going to go 4. Fruity. If this was a younger batch, you might expect to see some of that floral note, or even some of these like grassy or stone fruit aspects. I'm getting almost no fruit, so I'm going to go 1. Vegetal, I definitely get, for me, get some of this like brassica aspect to it, a little oniony. but it's not hugely pronounced because I really still think that this like buttery profile is dominating. So I'm gonna go with 3. Nutty. Now, nutty is going to be also part of the umami, and it's, I think, one of the most snackable parts of a cheese that really like in that flavor. And while we didn't really highlight nutty so much, earthy brothy is also something that would indicate to me that there is this like nuttiness to it. And so I'm going to say it's not hugely pronounced, but it's definitely there. And earthy. For me, getting closer to the rind, you really get that sense of the cave, the really like really nitty gritty part of it. And so I'd say it's like a little bit more pronounced than baseline. So we're gonna go 5. And so what's really interesting here now is we have a snapshot here of all of the flavor characteristics of this cheese. And what you'll see when you do the second cheese, as you plot it along these courses here, you're actually going to see each of the outliers and how they differ. And what's really important is that tasting one cheese once and evaluating it tells you a very short story. And so doing this ongoing with multiple batches and multiple cheeses and comparing them is really where this tool starts to come alive. And what I'm doing is working on through another platform on trying to make an easy inputted form to actually put in your scores, have it be part of a database, and then it compiles a much more accurate picture of different profiles and can separate them out. And so that's in the works. It's part of the sort of tool set I'm working on, but it's actually going to be something that's going to be really important for my work and just really understanding the difference in like seasonality or changing if a producer changes a milk source, and seeing if you can actually evaluate those changes and if it's actually helping or harming something that you're doing. Tasting 2 has led us to a delectable journey to the UK. And at the UK, if you're going to talk about any cheese organization, I think you at least have to say hi to Neal's Yard Dairy. And so I was able to tour with from farm all the way to shop, all aspects of Neal's Yard Dairy's work throughout the United Kingdom. And it's really important, I think, the work that they're doing specifically because the British cheese has a really rough history uh, in terms of almost being banned by the government through Listeria outbreak. And so a lot of those cheeses were either pasteurized and lost some of their individuality or became commodified, or even some recipes were smuggled off of trucks to be, not thrown away and lost forever. And so Neal's Yard is really working specifically with a feedback loop to really maintain the quality of their profiles that they're selecting for, but also the work of the cheesemakers to really keep these traditional styles really supported in the world scheme, but also in the UK. They don't have any PDO standardizations or AOP organizations, so they really have to do the work themselves of really like making sure that those cheeses are not lost to commodification. So what I got to do when I was with the crew on my very first day was join them in both a hard cheese and soft cheese grading. And what you see on the left there is the whole sales team, not just a cheesemaker, not just an affineur. Everyone joins the crew and they're tasting through, we tasted probably 15, 20 different cheeses. And what I thought was actually like astounding was that they were speaking a similar language. They were really kind of touching on the same notes or different aspects, but as it also relates to their specific customers. So you can see each of those salespeople, they're not selling to the same person. They're selling to restaurants. That's one guy. They're selling to distributors. They're selling export. They're selling to to like cheese shops. They're selling to their own cheese shop. And so they're really specific in selecting those batches that they know are going to do well on those counters or with those customers. And that's an intense customer relationship, but it's also an intense way of communicating what the cheese is and what it's doing and how it tastes. And then that being able for that customer to continue on that communication. And so they do this weekly. They're tasting everything and they're really making sure that they're like giving scores and assessments and then putting it in the right buckets. So is it going to go across the pond? Is it going to stay in the UK? Is it going to Europe? And that's a really important part of their process. And Gareth here, who's the hard cheese manager, he is championing what's on the left, which is profiling of each of their cheeses. Specifically, he's working on the hard cheeses and then working on the soft cheeses next. And what he has is the actual make processes, the different aspects or specifications of that cheese, and then the word clouds, which I think were absolutely brilliant, to really highlight the prominent notes. So like we were doing in that center of that graph there, or the flavor wheel, and then the other tertiary words that can also be used to describe and how they fit into a positive aspect of the cheese and a negative aspect of the cheese. So what that's doing is help guiding their communication about the different cheeses, but also allowing you to describe the cheese in a wider way without being stuck on specific words. And so it gives your vocabulary a little bit more depth, but also focuses what type of vocabulary you're using to describe something good versus something bad. And if you look on the very bottom, I'm still trying to understand what pappy means, but it's not good if you're talking about red Leicester. That's just pretty clear there. The next, what you see is actually something I thought was really important as part of that feedback loop. So we always think about like all this action happening inside the cave. It's really kind of indexed to the Afenor. They're actually encouraging the entirety of their line. So this is where the cut and wrap line is and the export line is. And they're actually encouraged to both taste what's out there. Those cheeses are out, they wrap them maybe every evening, but other than that, they're out and ready to go. And they're encouraged to taste before they ship it off onto a customer or wrap it in, put it into a gift box. And then they're given the tools on the left here to make an informed decision. So it's not just indexed to one professional on the floor. It's everyone is participating in this education and in this process of maintaining the sensory qualities of these cheeses. And the end result is it goes to Neosar Dairy, the shop, amongst other places. And so these cheesemongers here are in charge of then being that mouthpiece on the front lines to really communicate what's happening with the cheese, how to really get people to understand the flavors as they're sort of coalescing, and also then to provide feedback to the cheesemaker, who is then able to make a cheese that actually people are looking for, and not just trying to make the same thing and hope that it takes off or hope that it works. So I actually picked one cheese to follow, which was St. Helena from St. Jude's Cheese over in Suffolk. And Matt and I on the right in the very front, that's Matt. He's a soft cheese manager. We joined Blake Bowden, who's on the left pictured there, who is a cheesemaker from Australia who moved to the UK to make cheese at St. Jude. And he has created a style that's very similar to Saint Nectaire, which is a mold ripened semi-soft cheese that is actually extremely difficult to make, particularly because you need some technology that's going to make the curd structure happen in a very elastic way. But he does not have that technology. And so he does a lot of his cheese making through know-how and through feel. And what I thought was really sort of fascinating while we were all making cheese together is that on the left there, it looks like a seemingly innocuous photo of a man just like washing his hand with a hose. What he's actually doing is testing the temperature of the water that he's going to wash the curds with. And he knows when it's the right temperature, specifically based on that feel. And then he's adding water based on sight and sort of his understanding of the how much really the whey is at the level to wash his curd. So is it going to be a little different every time? Sure. But it's surprisingly tasting through 3 or 4 different days of production, he has an amazing consistency with his cheese. And on the right there, I thought it was really amazing to see that they don't have this technology. So to keep the milk at temp before they're ready to use it, they've got water bottles that are at temperature. So really kind of holding that milk temperature in those bins. You got to find what works when you're on this cheese with dairy, that's for sure. And so when those cheeses get eventually produced and sent off to Neil's yard in the very first stages of its life, this is the finished cheese. They want dappling of mucor, that mold that's very filamentous, typically seen as a infiltrator of KFC. So altogether, what that creates is probably one of the most delicious, simplest cheeses I've ever tried. Which when I think back to my wisdom that I've gotten from Gordon Ramsay, like if you're going to do it simple, do it well. And they absolutely nailed it. And so this cheese, I think, is a really an interesting way to really talk about this feedback loop, because now Matt's tasting it in the caves and he's going to go taste it with his sales team. It's going to go to the shop and then he's going to come back right around and say, Blake, your cheese is doing great. This cheese was over salted. The moisture's too high. The fat's getting rancid. So there's a lot of ways to communicate this aspect, and it's a really important part of that relationship that they have with the producers. And so for me, what I really found that was fascinating with Niels Dairy is that they're really working hard to develop this language, this way that we speak about cheese, not just with themselves, but also with their customers and with also with the farmers and the producers that are making the cheese. And those relationships are more valuable to them than gold. They go see those producers very regularly. They participate in selections with those producers. They're not going to take all of the cheese from Jamie Montgomery, but they're going to take a Neal's Yard selection that they know through tasting and doing year over year, month after month. And so those relationships are really at the core of their foundation. And this whole engagement and education around all of these evaluation processes is throughout their entire chain. It starts on the farm, but and they're teaching each other, but everywhere in the business, everyone is encouraged to taste and understand what the cheese is and why they are selling it to anyone in the world. And so for me, the work that they're doing is really truly protecting this British territorial terroir that really wouldn't be as robust as it is without them. Let's buckle up. We're going to Sweden. And I think this is probably one of the coolest places that I've been to in the cheesemaking community, particularly because it's a relatively nuanced cheesemaking operation in sort of the grand scheme of European cheeses. The Scandinavia is not overly known for a lot of cheesemaking besides like Gjetost or Gammelost. But this particular producer is on a Swedish manor that is dated back to the year 1225, which is quite old. And the first instances of the cheese has been dated back to the early 1800s. And really this whole acreage, which is about 5,000 hectares of land, most of it is devoted to lumber. But Thomas, pictured here on the right, the left of the right, is his family bought this property through primarily working lumber, and he is now transforming it into a cheese-making operation, really focusing on promoting the heritage of that place and also helping lift up different Scandinavian cheesemakers. And so what I was there for, purely actually by happenstance, was the Nordic Cheesemonger Summit. And so what Thomas is trying to do here is bring together Scandinavian cheesemakers from, we had Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And we had also some international folks like myself there, all to taste their cheeses. That a lot of them are cheesemakers or affineurs, and they brought their cheeses to taste. And so we had a full day of tasting about 30 different Scandinavian cheeses. Some were really standouts in terms of like their uniqueness to Scandinavia, and some were actually very reminiscent of European cheeses. And so you see on this plate here, cheeses that you might say like, I know that cheese, I know that cheese. And then there are also cheeses that are quite unique and very interesting in terms of their flavor profiles, but also their techniques and their textures. And so I was actually quite surprised at the diversity and the overall range of different flavors and textures. And when we actually participated in a small judging of all 30 cheeses, and the one that won was the most delicate, delightful lactic set soft ripened goat milk cheese made way north in Norway. And I think we all had to agree that it was just simple. The rind was thin, the paste was moist, and the flavors were not overpowering. It was a delicious cheese that you could keep eating and you would ask for someone else's cheese because you would just be that infatuated with it. And so these producers are making highly technical cheeses that are really, I think, stepping up to the world stage. And one of the cheeses that I think I have to highlight, especially because we tasted it today, Rangbak is first PDO in Sweden. It's got its first designation. It's sort of registered. It's known as the first registered cheese in Sweden as well. And this is a picture of the old caves that really are new old because they had to rebuild some of the facility due to a fire. And so this cheese was being made for a couple hundred years and then went out of production for about 60 years due to this fire. And when Thomas was starting to rebuild this cheese making operation, they actually had to find a 70-year-old gentleman who was the last remaining person of the cheese making facility before it had burned down. And they reverse engineered that recipe to try to recreate what Rangbak used to be. And so this is a true homage to this like heritage, but also recreating it within the modern era. And so what you see here is all done by hand. It's the old facility. It's kind of made to, you know, house some cheeses, but it's not overly technical. But we live in the future, and the future has robots. And so this is Elena. She's a beautiful robot. She flips, she washes, she puts the cheese right back in the same place. And what you see is a huge difference between those cheeses. And these cheeses are yet to be fully matured. I was there in May, and so I think we probably have another 3 months before those are going to even be wrapped and shipped off across the pond. But what's really amazing is that this technology is not seen as something like as a replacement to any of the people in the facility. This is like using a stove to cook a delicious steak. Like you can cook it over a fire with a stick and do all that, and maybe it works out, but maybe you burn half of it. Or you can get a machine that's going to make your job easier and let the humans do the thing that they do best, which is being the brain of the operation. And so instead of having people really doing this backbreaking labor, washing day in, day out, each with different pressures, different rotations, different sensibilities, you have a lot more consistency in your process, but you're also letting a machine do mechanical work. And turns out a lot of the time it's very helpful. And it's no wonder that the Swiss have already adopted it on those 80-pound wheels that they have going on. And so what you're seeing here is the birth of a new cheese that is really rooted in those traditions. So really, for me, what really was kind of amazing to see is that these sensory profiles that are coming out in Scandinavia are based in some of these traditional practices, but they're also utilizing a lot of modern techniques. So that's not just, you know, talking about robots, but it's also bringing in Central Europe and even the US and how they are making their cheeses, and understanding that those practices are also worthwhile of exploration. There is no like real consortium or rules in cheese making in Scandinavia that deter them from trying anything. The Nordic cheese community is blossoming, and it's new, and it's actually quite robust at this juncture. And there's some really state-of-the-art facilities that are making high quality cheese, and they're completely separate from the traditional European model. And a lot of this work is really meant to bring value back to the sort of agricultural practices of Scandinavia. So a lot of the times we don't really consider how beneficial like economically speaking, the cheese making operation or community is to the local community. And so for them, it's a way of really breaking into this new agricultural sector that is really untapped in their area, and bringing a lot more value and identity to this Scandinavian cheesemaking community. So to me, Almnas has really recreated a terroir. It is taken something that maybe was prominent in the 1800s and almost lost, and bringing it back, but within a modern context, which is really important. So this portion here, this was meant to really showcase sound as part of the tastings here. When I was tasting these cheeses, it was not in a vacuum, silent, by myself. It was with these people who were showing me and teaching and talking to me about what I'm tasting. And some French cheesemakers, some Swiss cheesemakers, some British cheesemakers, some Swedish cheesemakers, one delightful affineur from Belgium, just introducing who they are and what they do.
Hi, my name's Blake Bowden. I'm a cheesemaker for St. Jude Cheese and creator of our cheese St. Helena.
Hej, jag heter Kerstin Johansson. Jag jobbar på Almnäs bruk och är ansvarig för ostproduktionen på Almnäs ysteri. Tack!
Hi, my name is Gregory Egger. I'm export manager at Fromage Gruyère in Switzerland.
Sveiki, man sauc Rihards Lutiņš, es strādāju Almas Brukas ierotavā gandrīz jau gadu.
Hi, my name is Frederick van Tricht. I'm the owner of Casa Fineurs van Tricht in Antwerp, Belgium. We import and age cheese from 15 different countries, and we offer a selection of around 500 to 600 different cheeses that we supply to shops and restaurants in Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. Aside of that, we also promote Belgian cheese from small producers worldwide.
Hello, my name is Julie Cheney. I started St. Jude Cheese over 12 years ago now with St. Jude and the washed rind sister cheese, St. Sarah. We now make fresh curd and a semi-soft cheese called St. Helena, which Blake started making back in 2020.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Jules Mons, je suis fromager pour la maison Mons. Nous sommes fromagers et affineurs depuis les années 60. Nous sommes basés à Saint-Anne-de-Châtel, au nord de Lyon, en France. Et notre métier, c'est l'affinage de fromage, principalement des fromages français. Nous avons des caves et nous y mettons nos beaux fromages pour les affiner plus ou moins longtemps.
Hello, miteinander. My name is Benjamin. I'm a cheesemaker with master's degree. I'm the sales representative from Gourmino, Switzerland. Gourmino stands for longer aged and high quality raw milk cheeses like Emmentaler AOP or Le Gruyère AOP, made in our village and mountain dairies.
Hej, jag heter Nora och jag jobbar på Almnäs ysteri. Min huvuduppgift är att tvätta ost och jag håller också på att lära mig att tillverka ost.
Salut, Christophe Laupert, fromager de Gruyère à Grangette.
Hi, my name is Matt Carter and I work in the maturation team at Nils Yard Dairy, based in Bermondsey, London. Nils Yard Dairy select, mature and sell British and Irish cheeses with a focus on the use of raw milk and sustainable farming methods, pursuing a simple goal to improve British cheese. My own department is responsible for the receiving of cheese from our producers, maturing that cheese until it is ready for sale, and then working with our packing, sales and retail teams to make sure the right profile of cheese arrives to the right customer.
Hej, mitt namn är Stina Johansson. Jag jobbar på Almnäs bruk och jag håller på mycket med att göra ost och även mycket i HCCP-delen. Hej!
I always got goosebumps in this part of the presentation, a little teary-eyed, because it actually reminds me of being in that place with those people and that meaningful connection. I want to share a lot of my conclusions here because there's a lot of territory we covered, a lot of concepts that we went through, and a lot more to discover. And so I think really bringing it all home, we want to know, what is this all for? What do we do? How do we actualize this? And so for me, building your own program is really important, and trying to build something perfect once to like make all of your cheeses tastier, it's not going to happen. There is really no like one size fits all model. And I maybe in 20 years and 20 more scholarships, I'll create that perfect tool. But what I'm really learning is that these models or these practices need to adapt to both the industry area that you're in, but also to the cheese needs, to what that cheese is telling you and the cheese style that you're trying to create. And so applying a soft cheese grading formula or format to a Gruyere isn't going to really teach you anything or help you talk about Gruyere, and vice versa. And so you really have to be able to be flexible in changing your parameters. And a lot of that is data analysis and understanding, like, no one cares if our cheese is salty. Do we need to think about it? You know, those kind of aspects. The main thing, and I think the really hardest part about both being in the cheese industry and evaluating cheese, is it's not about whether or not you like it. And that's the hardest thing to think about. When you're doing an evaluation, you are evaluating these objective qualities, and letting the picture become clearer to you. And then your subjective preferences can maybe help inform whether or not you want to sell that cheese, or whether or not you want to go work for that producer, or whether or not that cheese is going to work on your counter. But making declarations that like that's a good cheese, that's a bad cheese, is not necessarily evaluating the characteristics of the cheese. And so I always try, it's tough for me as well, is if it's a style that I don't particularly gravitate towards, but it is manufactured perfectly, I have to give it a great score. And that's the point, is we're evaluating that cheese as it is and not making subjective judgments about what I want it to be, or whether or not I think it's better than any other cheese. And then to do it every day, practice, revision. That's the sensory practice that's getting in there. And that's really important because time after time, doing it in reference to a history of traditions and also different cheeses and working on your palate, it's sort of like becoming literate. And if you're trying to read a, higher level physics book and you've only passed like 4th grade, you could maybe read it, but you're not going to understand any of it. And so a lot of that is based in that practice, repetition, revision, and understanding that you're how to develop that nomenclature. And so what I'm trying to really do with my future work here is build out these tools like the spider graph. I would like to professionally make aromas that are not necessarily as delightful, like mold and ammonia and things like that, that are actually applicable to cheeses. In particular, a lot of the aroma kits are focused around wine and beer, and they just really don't overlap all that well. Tasting calibrations, so things that are like priming your palate. Russell Wilson from Australia, he does a really nice salt calibration, or like the base taste calibration, if you ever had a chance to do that at ACS. And really that's what that's doing, is understanding your sensibilities to something like salt or like bitter. Like I learned that I have a very low threshold for bitter. So a lot of cheeses, when they're very bitter, blow me away and I can't deal with it. But I have a rather high tolerance to salt. And so I have to really always check my salt preference with, or at least my evaluation of salt, with other people, because not everyone can handle that salt. And then another thing that I think would be really helpful and in building out this toolkit is simply basics, like how to plug a wheel, how to set up your own tastings, understanding data sets. That was something that was very challenging to me at the beginning, because there are so many different components. And then if you're making all these graphs and whatever, but you don't really understand what they're for, it's a lot of extra work. And so really building those informative practices there. And then hopefully what we've developed through this toolkit is a community around sensory evaluation. So we already have the ACS sensory evaluator certification. We're doing more classwork. I see a lot more sensory evaluation stuff happening out in the ether. And really what I think is it's really time for us to build a community around sensory evaluation as a way of life, a practice in the cheese industry, that it's not just segmented to being in situ in a tiny lab with a white coat taking scores down in the depths of a cave. I think we really need to just come together and learn how to talk about cheese together. And for those of you who are looking for more educational opportunities, I would really recommend going to these 3 organizations. Mostly, these are the ones that I would say are like the quintessential organizations to learn from, but there are other places doing some coursework, especially at the like higher education level. But I think it's really important to tie together really what I've learned as the foundation to my sensory evaluation practices and my education here, is that the human body is the most important tool we have for evaluating and understanding the value of those cheeses that we work with. And that goes from all the way from the grass to the table. I think it's sensory evaluation is also a focal point or even intersection where communities can come together and really understand the work that we're doing and actually become a more educational pursuit rather than just like a screwdriver to screw in a screw. It's a much more much more embodied process that we're currently doing as a community. I really want folks to remember feedback in terms of really that sensory language. Cheesemakers want to know what their cheese is doing. People at the counter, they want to know how to explain their cheese, talk about those different characteristics. So really building that feedback loop all through the chain is, I think, really important. Always taste cheese. If you're selling a cheese that you've never tasted, you're missing out, but also there's so much more to that cheese that it is telling you that you're missing. And so really, please be tasting cheese as much as possible, as often as possible, within reason, of course. But the more you taste, the more you can taste. It's just as simple as that. And last of the sensory memory, cheese is people. Cheese is people forever. And what you kind of learn through being in the cheese industry for as long as I have, at least, and there's many more people who've been in there longer, of course, you cannot take people away from the terroir of that cheese. It is intimately linked. And so at the end of the day, it's important to understand that cheese is good. It gives us an experience that is good in and of itself. The work we do nurtures people. It also provides people with an experience only possible through the people before us, and hopefully that lives on after us. It's a reflection of who we are and the work we do, and it is important for us to develop our sensory skills in order to be able to understand this legacy and help us create a fuller and richer experience. In light of globalization, industrial complexes, the future of the diversity and the identity of cheeses and the cheese community depends on our commitment to sensory practices. Thank you guys for joining us. I want to thank all of these wonderful people that I got to visit. I wouldn't be here without them, and I wouldn't be able to really share their stories and their work. That's something I really want to be important, is that I'm just a mouthpiece for these wonderful cheesemakers and cheese professionals. And it's the work that they're doing that has informed my practices and has taught me to be a better cheese professional. And thanks to this wide community of people who have mentored me, who have been on the board, and who have made a lot of this project possible, open doors that I never would have even dreamed of. And much love to all those guys.
And so on that note, thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Armstrong, for all of your prep and getting this together. And so excited to keep seeing this evolve and grow. Thanks.